It's one of the most consequential decisions in modern economic history. A shift that rewrote the rules of money, unleashed decades of inflation, and fundamentally altered what currency actually means. For over a century, the gold standard anchored the global economy. Money was tied to metal. Governments couldn't print at will, and currencies held their value across generations. Then, in a series of calculated moves spanning 50 years, nations abandoned it entirely. And behind every crisis, every war, every inflation spike since, this decision shaped the world we inherited. But here's the part no central banker wants you to examine too closely. The gold standard didn't fail. It was killed. And the reasons why reveal everything about who really controls money and what happens when governments decide limits are optional. Welcome to Finance History, where currency, power, and trust collide. And nothing works the way they promise it will. The story begins long before paper money existed. For most of human history, currency meant metal. Gold, silver, copper. These weren't just symbols of value. They were value. You couldn't print more gold. You couldn't decrease silver into existence. Scarcity was built into the system by geology, not government. This created natural discipline. If a king wanted to fund a war, he needed actual treasure. If a merchant wanted to trade, he needed real coins. The money supply grew only as fast as miners could pull metal from the earth. For thousands of years, this system worked. Slowly, brutally, but predictably. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Trade exploded. Economies grew complex. Carrying gold became impractical. So banks issued paper notes backed by gold reserves. The promise was simple. Bring this paper to the bank, and we'll exchange it for metal. The note wasn't a value. It represented value stored elsewhere. As long as people trusted the banks and governments behind the notes, the system functioned. By the late 1800s, most major economies operated on the classical gold standard. Britain led. Others followed. Each currency was defined by a fixed weight of gold. Exchange rates were stable because they were tied to something real. If Britain's pound was worth a certain amount of gold and France's franc was worth another amount, the exchange rate between them was just math. Governments couldn't manipulate it. Markets couldn't speculate on it. Money was boring, predictable, and that was the point. But running a gold standard requires discipline. Governments can't spend beyond their means. They can't inflate away debts. They can't print money to cover deficits. The gold reserves are the limit. And politicians hate limits. So when World War I erupted in 1914, the gold standard became the first casualty. Governments needed to finance unprecedented military spending. Gold reserves couldn't cover it. So one by one, European nations suspended convertibility. They printed paper money without gold backing. They borrowed recklessly. They inflated. And when the war ended, the world faced a choice. Return to gold discipline or embrace the new freedom to print. Most countries tried returning. Britain went back on gold in 1925. The United States never fully left. Germany, after hyperinflation destroyed the mark, re-anchored to gold by 1924. For a few years, it seemed the old system might survive. But the gold standard's weakness had been exposed. It worked beautifully in peacetime. It collapsed under crisis. And the crisis that truly killed it was just beginning. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and suddenly governments faced an impossible dilemma. Under the gold standard, when economies contracted, the money supply contracted too. Prices fell. Deflation set in. Businesses failed. Unemployment soared. And the only solution, under gold discipline, was to wait for markets to adjust naturally. That meant years of suffering. Politicians couldn't tolerate it. Voters demanded action. So countries started abandoning gold one by one. Britain left in 1931. The United States effectively left in 1933 when Roosevelt confiscated private gold and devalued the dollar. By the mid-1930s, the classical gold standard was dead. Nations had chosen inflation over deflation, stimulus over discipline, political survival over monetary restraint. And something fundamental shifted. For the first time in history, major currencies floated free from any anchor to physical scarcity. Money became whatever government said it was. After World War II, the victors tried to restore some discipline. At Bretton Woods in 1944, they created a compromise. The US dollar would remain convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies would peg to the dollar. It wasn't a true gold standard, but it was close. The system worked as long as the US maintained fiscal discipline. But discipline is temporary. Ambition is permanent. By the 1960s, The United States was funding the Vietnam War, expanding welfare programs and running deficits that required more dollars than gold reserves could support. Other countries noticed. France especially. President Charles de Gaulle began demanding gold in exchange for dollars. He saw what was coming. The U.S. was printing more dollars than it had gold to back. The system was a fiction, and France wasn't going to be left holding worthless paper. The pressure mounted. By 1971, foreign central banks held more dollars than the U.S. had gold. The math was simple. If everyone demanded conversion, the U.S. would default. So on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced the unthinkable. The United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. The link was severed. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. And for the first time in modern history, the world's reserve currency was backed by nothing but trust in the U.S. government. The consequences were immediate and profound. Without gold discipline, governments could print freely. And they did. The 1970s became a decade of inflation, oil shocks, and currency instability. Prices rose faster than wages. Savings eroded. Trust in money wavered. But there was no going back. Because once governments tasted the freedom to print, to spend, to inflate away debts, they would never voluntarily return to limits. And that brings us to the world we live in today. Every major currency is now fiat, backed by nothing tangible, created by central banks with keystrokes. And the money supply expands or contracts based on policy decisions, not physical scarcity. Advocates claim this gives governments flexibility. They can fight recessions by printing money. They can stimulate growth. They can manage crises without waiting for markets to adjust. And in theory, responsible central banks can control inflation through interest rates and regulation. But theory and practice are different universes. In practice, every fiat currency in history has eventually failed. Not through invasion or collapse, but through inflation. Slow at first, then catastrophic. The temptation to print is irresistible. Deficits grow, debts accumulate, and the easiest solution is always the same. Create more money. That's what happened to Rome with debased coins. That's what happened to revolutionary France with assignats. That's what happened to Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. The names change. The pattern doesn't. And while modern central banks insist they're different, that they've learned from history, that technology and expertise make fiat currency sustainable, the evidence suggests otherwise. Since 1971, the U.S. dollar has lost over 85% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 in 1971 now costs more than $7. The inflation is slow enough that most people don't notice year to year. But across a lifetime, the erosion is devastating. Savings become worthless. Retirement plans require constant adjustment. And the middle class, those who rely on wages and savings rather than assets, bear the heaviest burden. Meanwhile, those who own real estate, stocks, commodities, gold benefit. Because inflation pushes asset prices higher. The wealthy get wealthier. The gap widens. And the system that was supposed to provide flexibility has instead created the largest wealth inequality in a century. But it's not just the United States. Every major economy faces the same dynamic. The European Central Bank prints euros. The Bank of Japan prints yen. The People's Bank of China prints yuan. And each one insists it's managing the money supply responsibly. Yet debt levels globally have reached unprecedented heights. Governments own more than their economies produce. Central banks hold trillions in assets they created from nothing. And the only reason the system hasn't collapsed is because everyone pretends it's sustainable. This is where the gold standard debate becomes more than historical curiosity. Because the fundamental question remains, should money be anchored to something scarce, or should governments control the supply? Under gold, the answer was clear. Money had limits. Under fiat, the answer is trust us. And increasingly, people don't. That's why Bitcoin emerged in 2008. It's why gold prices surged in the 2010s. It's why debates about monetary policy have become central to political discourse. Because deep down, people sense that fiat money is a gamble. A bet that governments will restrain themselves. That central banks will act responsibly. That inflation will remain manageable. But history suggests that bet always fails eventually. So what actually happened when nations abandoned the gold standard? In the short term, they gained flexibility. They could respond to crises without waiting for gold reserves. They could fund wars, welfare, and infrastructure without immediate fiscal constraints. And for a while, it seemed like liberation. But in the long term, they lost discipline. Deficits became permanent. Debt became normal. Inflation became policy. And the slow erosion of purchasing power became the hidden tax that funds modern governments. The gold standard didn't fail because it was flawed. It failed because it was inconvenient. It constrained power. And power, once tasted, is never voluntarily surrendered. Look at the modern world. Central banks have become the most powerful institutions on earth. They set interest rates that determine the cost of borrowing for governments, corporations, and individuals. They create trillions in new money. They bail out banks, buy government bonds, and manipulate markets. And they operate with almost no democratic oversight. Under the gold standard, none of this was possible. The money supply was fixed. Interest rates were determined by markets. And central banks were constrained by reserves. Now, they're constrained only by their own judgment. And that judgment, as history shows, is rarely as wise as they claim. The 2008 financial crisis was caused by central banks keeping interest rates too low for too long. The inflation of the 2020s was caused by central banks printing trillions in response to COVID. Every crisis they solve creates the next one. Because without limits, mistakes compound. And the people who pay the price are never the central bankers. They're the workers whose wages don't keep up. The retirees whose pensions lose value. The savers who watch their nest eggs shrink. The young who can't afford housing. So when people ask whether the gold standard could return, the real question is whether governments would ever accept limits again. And the answer is almost certainly no. Because modern economies are built on debt. Governments owe more than they can repay. Pensions promise more than demographics can support. And the only way to sustain the illusion is to keep printing. A return to gold would force immediate austerity. Governments would have to balance budgets. Debts would have to be repaid or defaulted. And politically, that's impossible. Which means we're locked into the fiat system until it breaks. And history suggests it will break. Not tomorrow, not next year, but eventually. Because no fiat currency has ever survived long term. The only question is how the collapse happens. Hyperinflation like Weimar. Slow erosion like the modern dollar. Or sudden loss of confidence like the Soviet ruble. The mechanism varies. The outcome doesn't. But here's the part most people miss. The gold standard debate isn't really about gold. It's about discipline. It's about whether money should be controlled by markets or governments. It's about whether scarcity should be natural or political. Gold was simply the most effective anchor humanity ever found. It couldn't be printed, manipulated, or decreed into existence. It forced honesty, and that's precisely why it was abandoned. Because honesty limits power, and power never accepts limits willingly. The world we inherited is the result of that choice. A world where money is infinite in theory, but worthless in practice. Where wealth transfers from savers to debtors, from workers to asset owners, from future generations to current governments. Where the rules change constantly, but the direction is always the same. More printing, more debt, more inflation. And the consequences are predictable. Look at housing costs. Look at education costs. Look at healthcare costs. These aren't rising because of scarcity. They're rising because money is abundant. When governments can print, when credit is unlimited, prices inflate to absorb the new money. And those who produce real value, workers, small businesses, families, fall further behind. The gold standard prevented this. It capped the money supply. It forced governments to live within their means. It protected savers. It rewarded productivity. And it punished fiscal irresponsibility immediately. But it also prevented governments from funding wars easily, from bailing out banks, from smoothing over crises with printed money. It made hard choices unavoidable. And politicians, then as now, hate hard choices. So they chose the easy path. Print, inflate, defer. And we're living with the consequences. If the last century taught us anything, it's this. Money without limits eventually becomes worthless. Governments without discipline eventually become corrupt. And systems without accountability eventually collapse. The gold standard had flaws. It was rigid. It amplified deflation. It couldn't respond quickly to shocks. But it had one irreplaceable virtue. It was honest. And honesty, in monetary systems as in life, is the foundation of trust. When that trust disappears, when people stop believing in the currency, when they realize the system is rigged, the collapse isn't gradual. It's sudden. And by the time most people see it coming, it's too late to protect themselves. That's why understanding this history matters. Because the decision to abandon gold wasn't made for your benefit. It was made for theirs. The governments, the banks, the elites who benefit from inflation. And if you don't understand how the system works, you'll keep playing a game where the rules are designed for you to lose. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.